So in many ways this video is kind of spur of the moment, but I just watched a recent video by Áine Órga, or at least that's her channel name. Excellent channel if you've never heard of it. I will link the specific video below. I don't remember what the video is titled, but it's very recent. It came out this week, and she just kind of goes over life. She's also a PhD student. She's studying in Edinburgh. She is studying religion and religious studies, and she kind of talks out her thoughts about some of the struggles that she's gone through when putting together her research, and she makes connections with other aspects of her life, and her thought process reminded me of a lot of the thoughts that I've had rolling around in my brain, and it kind of inspired me to sit down and make this video today to talk about some of the things that I've been reading as I prepare for my exam, my big PhD exam, which is coming up at the end of the month. So if you don't see me for a while, that's what I'll be doing. Although I do have a couple other videos planned that I would like to make. But in her video, Áine, and I know that's her channel name. I don't really know her real name, but she talks about some of the frustrations she's come across in preparing the research for her dissertation, because she is interested in looking at the dark goddess, and she is interested in looking into neo-paganism and showing how it is legitimate religion, which in a lot of the research that she's done, she's come across kind of biased research and beliefs, arguing or trying to show that neo-paganism isn't a legitimate religion, and a lot of those arguments had to do with this transcendental versus immanent binary, how because neo-paganism values the material world and materiality and the body, then, kind of using that as a way to disprove neo-paganism's claim to being legitimate religious practice or a legitimate form of spirituality. And a lot of these claims and a lot of this research is coming from a very, as Áine said in her video, Christocentric perspective, and I would say Western, a very Western, Eurocentric, Christian-centric, or monotheistic-centric perspective, which has always valued the transcendent over the immanent, I would argue. This physical reality, this body, is something that we have to suffer through in order to die, and in death, if we've been good Christians or whatever, we transcend to something beyond, to something that is somehow more holy or more important than physical existence. And I've noticed this transcendent versus immanent split myself in my own research, and actually I've seen and I've read other authors in my research, in my reading list for my exam, that kind of take it a step further and show how this transcendent versus immanent split is not just Eurocentric and Christocentric. It's been used through colonialism, through the process of various colonial projects. It's been used to dehumanize black and brown people and women, and eventually, going through modernity and whatnot to the contemporary period, it's also used to dehumanize anyone that's LGBTQ, anyone queer, anyone different. So I kind of wanted to go over some of the readings that I've been doing to kind of highlight this this other aspect of this transcendent versus immanent split, how like I said, through colonialism, it was brought to the New World and brought to other parts of the world, brought to Africa, brought to Asia, through these different European colonial projects, starting in the 1500s, right? Or late 15th century into the 16th century and so on. And how, really, it's just a continuation of medieval beliefs. Of using the word Christian as an identity category, not just in a religious context, but in defining who is really human, who gets to claim to be fully human, right? And by claiming or defining who is fully human, you're also claiming and defining who is not. So, I guess the first author I would point to, I wouldn't suggest this author because the writing is super dense and super academic. Like, you have to be very familiar with post-colonial theory to get this. But, I mean, if you want a challenge, you can email me and I will send you the PDF of this. But it's a big-ass, thick essay called Unsettling, the Coloniality of Being / Power / Truth / Freedom Towards the Human, After Man, Its Overrepresentation and Argument. And this is by Sylvia Winter. And Sylvia Winter, she was born in Cuba to Jamaican parents, but she grew up in Jamaica. She is still alive. I think she's getting up there, though. She's in her 80s. But she is an essayist, a theorist, a post-colonial theorist, a historian. Like, she does it all, and she's brilliant. And she's basically building on an already established world of Caribbean post-colonial theory, which with Aimé Césaire and Fanon and other thinkers and writers of the early to mid-20th century, who proposed new ways of thinking and being, and this included new ways of organizing knowledge. Including Césaire, especially in his discourse on colonialism, or am I mixing him up with, I think I'm mixing him up with someone else, but anyway, they're proposing new ways of being, thinking, and organizing knowledge, and this is like shaking up academia globally as it's been construed through the European colonial projects. It's shaking up how we think, who we think we are, how we organize knowledge, just everything. It's all mind-blowing and interconnected. So yeah, in Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, and Freedom, Sylvia Winter, and I'll include the full title below, she goes all the way back to medieval Europe and traces how this binary of began as the Christian versus the non-Christian, and how that category of Christian was used to define who is man, who gets the claim to be fully man. And she uses the word man and not human on purpose because it was an exclusionary category. It was a category meant to elevate some and put down others, basically, right? And it's really interesting because I have read medieval texts. Like, I've read medieval Portuguese and Spanish literature. And I was able to do that in the original medieval Portuguese and Spanish because Portuguese and Spanish actually hasn't changed much over the centuries, not as much as English has. But anyway, in this literature, medieval and into the Renaissance period, they use the word Christian to refer to the language someone is speaking. And that, in turn, defines who is European, who is closer to God, versus the other, the African other, the Muslim other, just anybody who isn't close to God, a heathen, a pagan, whatever, right? Well, Winter starts there, and then she moves on into the Renaissance period, the period with the rise of humanism and the scientific revolution, and how this definition of man as Christian morphed into man as the rational, and the valuing rationality over what is perceived as the feminine irrational dates back to like Plato and Aristotle, right? So yeah, medieval period, on to the Renaissance, on to more secular humanism, on to the scientific revolution, on into the 19th century with the rise of Darwinism. She traces how this exclusionary definition of man morphed and adapted over time and became a critical tool in colonialism, in how Europeans justified the enslavement and the genocide and the forced conversion of Native peoples and African peoples, right? At least in the New World, North and South America context. Fascinating stuff, super dense. It took me several days to get through this essay. But fascinating, and it will prove to be kind of a cornerstone in my own research project or projects down the road. Now, again, valuing the corporeal and the physical and physical reality, and in a very pagan way, in my own definition of pagan, as viewing physical reality as just as important as anything that could be transcendent, right? Following down that road, we have this, and I really cannot recommend this book enough. Everyone should read this. Everyone. And it's written in accessible language. You don't need to have a PhD to understand this. This bridge called my back. Writings by Radical Women of Color. And I'm within the world of Latinx studies or Latino studies, right? So I read a lot of women of color feminist writings, and as well as understanding the history and how feminism over time has morphed and changed, right, and become more inclusive and not just a movement of middle upper class white women, right? This book came out in the early 80s. It was groundbreaking. It is a classic. It is widely read. And in this book, you find the term theory in the flesh. And that idea is that the personal experience, the corporeal experience, the physical reality, and the physical experience is or can be a place from which you can theorize. And that is groundbreaking too, because that really busts through that rational versus irrational, mind versus body, Cartesian split or binary, right? And this book, even though it was written nearly 30 years ago, it's just as important to read it today. The voices of these different feminists of color, their perspectives, and their interventions in the world of feminism and post-colonial theory, their voices are much needed today, believe me, especially in the political climate in the United States right now in 2018. This shit's important. So I cannot recommend this book enough, really, really. It will help you cleanse your soul, especially if you are, like me, a white person, especially a white person who lives outside of Europe, who got to where they are, or whose ancestors got to where they went through colonialism. Like, my ancestors were colonists, right? It's important to read and learn about your privilege, that's what I'm saying. So, along the same lines, Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, La Frontera, she was also a contributor and helped to organize this book, this bridge. But this came out in 1987. This was her groundbreaking work. It's a mixture of essays and historical analysis and poetry and personal experience, and she talks about her own spiritual experiences. this was a groundbreaking book and basically the foundation of a whole field of border studies within the fields of women of color feminisms and immigration studies and immigration rights and post-colonial theory. This is a fundamental text. I really cannot emphasize that enough. And again, you don't need a PhD to read this. In a way, her writing is more accessible and more important than some of the densest theories that I've read. So, really cannot recommend that enough if you want to explore more about theory in the flesh and how radical that is, really. Again, going along the same lines, Chandra Talpade-Mohanty's Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity. This came out in the early 2000s, but it's a collection of her essays. Some of the essays date back to the 80s, some are more recent, but she is a feminist scholar, originally from India, but she is teaching and working in the United States now, and she, especially in her introduction, she is a loud and proud anti-racist feminist, anti-capitalist feminist, and anti-colonialist feminist. And one thing it's important to remember about feminism is that if we promote a feminism that somehow thinks that it is free from any sort of critique, then that's not real feminism. And these women of color feminists that I've been talking about in this book, and this book, made really important interventions into the fields of feminism, and its branching, connecting fields, to ultimately make feminism more inclusive and better and more powerful. So, if you're a self-proclaimed feminist, but you hold racist beliefs, you're not a real feminist. If you're a self-proclaimed feminist, but you have some transphobic tendencies, you're not a real feminist. That's what these authors are pointing out. And this author, specifically, Mohanty in Feminism Without Borders, would argue that it's also very important to be critical of capitalism and to be aware of colonialism and to be anti-racist. So very, very important interventions in the field that I agree with. Another really interesting work that I wasn't very familiar with, but I added this to my reading list because it was one of the important theoretical works for my advisor's book. It's called Volatile Bodies Towards a Corporeal Feminism by Elizabeth Grosz. This came out in the early 90s. I have a PDF form of it, but it's in the form of a book. You can buy it on Amazon. Okay, and here again, not so much from a post-colonial perspective, but more from a post-structuralist perspective, Grosz also is looking for a way to kind of move beyond this binary of mind, body, male, female, rational, irrational, transcendent, immanent, all these binaries that are kind of interwoven and interconnected, right? Let me see if I can find an interesting quote, because this was a really interesting read. I read the introduction, the first chapter, and another chapter. Here's an interesting quote about the body, because it is toward a corporeal feminism. She is kind of critical of some of the feminist scholars of her day, keeping in mind this is from the early 90s, which seem to perpetuate that mind-body split by viewing the body as just this object that received the projected ideologies of a society, right? Seeing the body as just this stale blank slate, a tabula rasa, right? Ultimately, she's arguing for, in the introduction, a feminist reconfiguration of the body. So here she says, toward the end of the introduction, if feminists are to resuscitate a concept of the body for their own purposes, it must be extricated from the biological and pseudo-naturalist appropriations from which it has historically suffered. The body must be understood through a range of disparate discourses and not simply restricted to naturalistic and scientistic modes of explanation. There are other ways in which sexually specific corporeal differences may be understood than those developed in more conventional and scientific representational contexts. And later on down the paragraph she says, and this is important, other forms of knowledge, other modes of knowing than those which currently prevail will need to be undertaken. This means, among other things, not only contesting the domination of the body by biological terms, but also contesting the terms of biology itself. Rethinking biology so that it too is able to see the body in terms other than those thus far developed. That kind of leads me back to what Sylvia Winter and some of those other Caribbean post-colonial theorists were saying about how we organize knowledge and their call to new forms of organizing that kind of move beyond mind-body, hard sciences, social sciences / humanities splits, right? Even though Elizabeth Grosz doesn't make that connection explicit, I do. So yeah, Volatile Bodies is really fascinating. She talks a lot about the post-structuralists, Spinoza, the post-structuralist feminist, Irigaray, Deleuze, Guattari, all those French people and European thinkers that were in vogue in the 80s and into the 90s. But yeah, that's what I've been reading. Well, that's some of what I've been reading. I'm also excited to dive back into queer utopianism and where all that fits in. This is Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia. I also just recently got in the mail, and I'm excited to start reading this, Sexual Futures, Queer Gestures, and Other Latina Longings by Juana María Rodríguez. I think, where does she teach? I know this is published by New York University Press. I can't remember where she teaches. But this is also about queer utopianism and performance theory. Specifically, she talks about gestures and how gestures are kind of like language, an unspoken language, of course, but they convey meaning, right? I've only gone to page 7 in this, so a lot more to go, but really excited. And look at this cover. I love the images on this cover. Fucking right. I think actually, where does she say it? In this, let me just read a little bit because it's so great. In this text, gesture serves metaphorically to register the actions of the body politic, those activist interventions that push, jam, open, block, and twist social forces in the material world, valuing the material, right? The body, the movements of the body. But it is also used to name specific corporeal articulations of fingers, thighs, tongues, the movement of the living body and her parts, the ephemera of affect that leaves no trace. Gestures are where the literal and the figurative copulate. It's so good! I love what I study. I get swamped by stress and anxiety, especially when I'm about to take an exam or start writing my dissertation here soon, later on this year. So sometimes I have to remind myself of that. But I do love what I study, and I hope this little foray into my exam reading list has been interesting. And again, thanks to Áine Órga. I don't know if you're ever going to come across this video, but thank you for sharing your own thoughts and your own experiences going through the PhD and life. PhDs can be intense, but also such fruitful opportunities for exploration. I mean, it really is a privilege to be a PhD student, to work on research like this, because you really get to explore ideas in a way that it's very unique, I would say. And so thank you for sharing your experiences and your research a little bit. I do hope you share your research more, because I'm such a nerd. I would love to see it, the Dark Goddess and neo-paganism and where that fits into or breaks from more traditional understandings of religion, especially Christocentric understandings of religion. Super fascinating stuff. Like, if you enjoyed my video, you should check out her video, which is linked below, along with the titles to some of these works that I've mentioned. But yeah, one of the reasons why I love being a pagan is because in my definition, paganism, and I'll make a video about this in the future, going way more in depth in the coming months, after I finish this exam, I promise. But one of the things about paganism or neo-paganism or whatever you want to call it, that I love is the revalorization of the physical, the corporeal, the immanent physical reality, and the physical body itself, like valorizing it and putting it up on a pedestal for once and just enjoying it and the value of pleasure, things like that. I love it. I love being a pagan, a pantheist, pagan chaos witch. So anyhow, yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been super rambly, but sometimes you gotta ramble. And it's also been helping me, making this video has helped me to see where I'm at in my own understanding and all the connections I'm making between all these works, because my reading list is like 80 plus authors long. I've been reading since last semester, so in my responses to the exam questions, I need to be able to interweave all of these authors and make connections, which I love doing. So, wish me luck on that. I hope you'll see me again soon, probably for a lighter video before the actual exam goes down at the end of April, and then hopefully you'll see more of me in May and throughout the summer. So, until next time, many blessings. Bye.